Thaddeus Bramwell was mending a fence line when he saw them coming. He figured it was a mirage at first, a trick of the heat shimmering off the valley floor. But the shapes kept coming, stumbling through the sagebrush like a dozen broken dolls. This wasn't possible. Nobody came to the Bramwell spread. Not anymore. For 10 long years, he'd lived with the ghosts of his past on 3,000 acres of unforgiving land, and the silence was the only friend he had left. The nearest town was a day's ride, and the nearest neighbor was 15 miles of dust and rock. That's exactly how he liked it. After he buried Martha, he'd built walls around his heart higher than any mountain, and he'd sworn no one would ever cross them again. But now they were crossing his land. 12 of them, women in the tattered remains of saloon dresses, limping and bleeding and running from something awful. He could see the pain even from 100 yards out. One woman's arm was held at a strange angle. Another was being practically carried by her friends. Their fancy dresses, once bursting with color, were now ripped to shreds, stained with mud and blood and fear. Thaddeus set down his pliers, his hand instinctively finding the worn grip of the peacemaker on his hip. He walked back to his porch, the old wood groaning under his weight, and waited. These weren't lost travelers. These were fugitives. The one in the lead, a woman with hair the color of a sunset and eyes that burned like green fire, stopped 50 yards from his porch. She held up her empty hands, but her chin was held high. She wasn't begging for mercy. She was demanding a chance. Behind her, the others huddled together, their eyes wide with terror, scanning the horizon. "Mister," she called out, her voice raw but strong. "We need help. We can't go no further." Thaddeus stayed silent, his thumb resting on the hammer of his pistol. He scanned each face. Bruises shaped like fists, a split lip, crudely stitched. The youngest one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 17, had terror carved so deep into her face it looked like a permanent brand. She looked like Martha had all those years ago, young, breakable, and full of a light the world was trying to snuff out. That single thought was a crack in the wall he'd spent a decade building. "Where you from?" he asked, his voice a rusty hinge from disuse. He already knew the answer. "Devil's Creek," the redhead said. "The silver dollar." Thaddeus felt his jaw tighten into a knot of cold iron. The silver dollar. A name whispered in saloons and barbershops all across the territory. It was Silas Morrison's place, a gilded cage where women went in, but their dreams never came out. "Who's chasing you?" he asked. The woman's fierce eyes flickered. "The man who thinks he owns us." And just as she said it, Thaddeus heard it, a low, distant rumble, the sound of a dozen heavy hooves eating up the ground, coming fast. The women heard it too. A wave of panic washed over them. The young one, Penny, crumpled to the ground, sobbing. The riders were close, too close. They'd be here in 20 minutes. Thaddeus looked at the terrified faces, at the blood on their clothes, at the setting sun that promised no safety, only a darker place to die. The smart thing to do was to turn them away, to point them toward the mountains and wish them luck. His solitude was his armor, and letting them in meant letting the world in, with all its violence and its pain. But then he looked at Penny again, her small body shaking with sobs, and he didn't see a stranger. He saw Martha, and in that heartbeat the decision was made. "Get inside," he growled, "now." The redhead, Cordelia, didn't waste a second. She snapped orders, helping the injured, pulling Penny to her feet. In a flash, all 12 of them were crammed into his small cabin, their ragged breaths filling the silence he had cherished for so long. He slammed the heavy oak door and threw the bolt. The sound echoed like a gunshot, a declaration of war. He moved to the gun cabinet his grandfather had built, the one filled with the tools of a life he thought he'd left behind. "How many?" he asked Cordelia, his hands moving with an old familiar muscle memory as he loaded a Winchester rifle. "6, she said, her voice trembling slightly as she tore a strip from her dress to bandage another woman's arm. "But it's Silas Morrison himself leading them. He don't let his property just walk away." The name hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. Morrison, a man who bought sheriffs like cattle and burned down homesteads that got in his way. A man who ruled his corner of the world with fear. "These women ain't property," Thaddeus said. the words tasting like rust and fury in his mouth. Cordelia gave him a look, a mix of surprise and pity. Tell that to the law. Morrison owns Sheriff Hackett body and soul. Saloon. Through the narrow window, Thaddeus could see the dust cloud of the riders getting closer, a brown smudge of death against the orange sky. They were coming for their property. They were coming to make an example. One of the women, Belle, a tough-looking woman with old scars on her arms, grabbed Cordelia's sleeve. They're going to do to us what they did to Rosie, she whispered, her voice cracking. Cordelia's face went pale. Hush, Belle. But it was too late. Thaddeus had heard. What happened to Rosie? He demanded. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, counting down the seconds they had left. Finally, Cordelia spoke, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Rosie tried to leave a few months back. Morrison caught her. He hung her from the saloon balcony for 2 days, told everyone she'd taken her own life. A dark, cold rage began to smolder in Thaddeus's gut. It was a feeling he recognized, the ghost of a man he used to be, a man who believed in justice, until the war taught him that justice was just a word for the winner. He'd buried that man right next to Martha, but now he could feel him digging his way out. Mr. Bramwell, Cordelia said, her voice soft, you don't have to do this. We can still try to run for the mountains. Thaddeus chambered around in the Winchester. The click was the loudest sound in the room. You won't make it 2 miles, not with your injured, not with them on fresh horses. The hoofbeats were loud now, a drumbeat of doom. 7 riders. Morrison had brought an extra man. He looked at the women. They were broken birds, but in Cordelia's eyes he still saw a flicker of fire. I suggest, Thaddeus said, his voice low and dangerous, we teach Silas Morrison a lesson about what happens when you try to claim something that ain't yours. The riders pulled up just beyond the fence line. The man in the lead was built like a grizzly bear, with a thick neck and a cruel slash of a mouth. That had to be Morrison. He swung down from his horse with the easy arrogance of a man who had never been told no. His men fanned out, their hands resting casually on their holstered guns. The message was clear. Give them back or die. Bramwell! Morrison's voice was a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. I know you're in there. You got something that belongs to me. Thaddeus stepped out onto the porch alone, his rifle held loosely at his side, pointed at the ground. He was a stone wall against the coming storm. Don't see anything here that belongs to you, Morrison? Morrison let out a short, ugly laugh. 12 of my girls. Ran off in the night. Took a good bit of my money with them. Their tracks lead right to your front door. Maybe they kept running, Thaddeus said, his voice calm. It's a big country. Morrison's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Don't you play games with me, old man. I got a witness who saw them head this way. Now you can send them out, and I'll forget this ever happened. Or we can do this the hard way. Thaddeus's grip tightened on the Winchester. What gives you the right to call them yours? Legal contract, Morrison sneered. They owe me for their keep. Till that debt's paid, their hides belong to me. Thaddeus felt the old rage stir again. That sounds a lot like slavery, Morrison, and I seem to recall us fighting a war over that. This ain't slavery, it's business, Morrison spat, and I always collect on my investments. Behind him, one of his men shifted nervously. Boss, maybe we should just go. This ain't worth the trouble. Morrison spun around and backhanded the man so hard he stumbled and fell. I decide what's worth the trouble, he bellowed. These women need to learn a lesson. Everyone in this territory needs to learn it. Thaddeus watched the casual brutality and knew there would be no reasoning with this man. He was a rabid dog, and there was only one way to deal with a rabid dog. What if I told you, Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to an icy calm, that I'd pay their debts, all of them. Name your price. For a split second, a flicker of greed crossed Morrison's face. He actually considered it, but then his eyes hardened again, the cruelty returning. This ain't about money anymore, Bramwell. This is about principle. You don't steal from Silas Morrison and get away with it. He gestured to his men. Now send them out, or we're coming in. Thaddeus raised his rifle, the barrel now level with Morrison's chest. And what if I say no? In an instant, 6 more guns were drawn, all pointed at the lone man on the porch. The odds were impossible, but then something happened that Morrison didn't expect. The cabin door creaked open, and Cordelia stepped out, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in her hands. And behind her, the other 11 women filled the doorway, armed with every rifle, pistol, and axe Thaddeus owned. Morrison's jaw dropped. He stared at the small army of determined women, and for the first time, a sliver of uncertainty crept into his eyes. "Well, I'll be," he chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Looks like the rabbits grew claws." "You taught us how to survive, Silas," Cordelia called out, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You always said only the meanest make it in this world. Looks like we were listening." Morrison's face turned purple with rage. "You put those guns down. You don't know the first thing about using them. We know which end the bullets come out of," Bell shouted from the doorway. "And we know who we're aiming at." Thaddeus felt a surge of pride. These weren't victims anymore. They were warriors ready to fight for the one thing they had left: each other. "Morrison," Thaddeus said, his voice like the crack of a whip, "you have 10 seconds to get off my land before this gets ugly." Morrison just laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you and a dozen soiled doves can stop me and my men? I've been putting down rebellions my whole life." But then one of his men made a mistake. A young gunman, eager to prove himself, shifted his aim from Thaddeus to the young girl, Penny, who was trembling in the doorway, clutching an old Navy Colt that was almost too big for her hands. The sight of that man pointing a gun at that terrified child flipped a switch in Thaddeus's soul. The rancher was gone. The grieving husband was gone. All that was left was the man he had tried to bury, the man who knew exactly how to kill. And in that moment, Thaddeus Bramwell made a choice. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't hesitate. He swung the barrel of the Winchester a few inches to the right, aimed at the man threatening Penny, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was a deafening crack that echoed across the valley. Morrison's man screamed and spun around, a red flower blooming on his shoulder as he hit the dirt. The world exploded into chaos. The rest of Morrison's men opened fire, bullets tearing into the log walls of the cabin, splintering wood and shattering glass. Thaddeus shoved Cordelia back inside, shielding her with his body as the front of his home was shredded by lead. "Get down! Stay away from the windows!" he roared over the gunfire. He peered through a crack in the wall. Morrison had taken cover behind a water trough, and his men were spreading out, trying to flank the house. 2 were making a run for the barn on the left, while another 3 were circling around the right. They were professionals. They were trying to create a kill box. "Cordelia, how many of them can actually shoot?" he yelled, ramming fresh cartridges into his rifle. "Bell and me, for sure," she yelled back. "Maybe 2 others. The rest are just holding guns to look scary." A bullet punched through the wall right next to Thaddeus's head, showering him with wood splinters. They couldn't stay in the cabin. It was a coffin. Morrison's voice boomed from outside. "You want a war, Bramwell? You got one. Boys, burn the barn. Smoke 'em out like the rats they are." Thaddeus's blood ran cold. The barn was his weak spot. It was filled with dry hay and lamp oil. If they got a torch to it, the whole place would go up like a powder keg, and the fire would jump to the house in minutes. They'd be faced with an impossible choice: burn alive or run out into a hail of bullets. He saw one of the men near the barn pull a torch from his saddlebag. He was striking a match. This was it. The end of the line. "We're trapped," Cordelia whispered, her face pale with dread. "He's going to burn us alive." Thaddeus looked at the faces of the women huddled on the floor. They had come to him for sanctuary, and he had led them into a death trap. The weight of his failure was crushing him. But then he heard it. A new sound, distinct from the crack of gunfire. It was the thunder of more horses coming fast from the North Ridge. A lot of them. Was it more of Morrison's men? Had he called for reinforcements? The gunfire outside suddenly stopped. Morrison must have heard them too. Thaddeus risked a glance out the window. Morrison was staring at the ridge, a look of confusion on his face. And then they appeared. A column of riders moving in a disciplined line, their blue coats and shining badges unmistakable in the fading light. It was the U.S. Marshals. For a single fleeting moment, Thaddeus felt a surge of relief. The law was here. They were saved. But that relief turned to ice in his stomach when he saw the man at the head of the column. A man with a long gray coat and a face like a tombstone. Marshal Clayton Reed. A man known for two things: following the letter of the law, no matter how unjust, and his close political ties to the richest men in the territory. "Marshal Reed!" Morrison shouted, waving a piece of his shirt like a white flag. "Thank God you're here. This man, Bramwell, is harboring fugitives and thieves. He's attacked me and my men." Thaddeus swore under his breath. Morrison wasn't just a thug, he was a well-connected thug. Reed would see this as a property dispute, and the law was on Morrison's side. Reed dismounted, his 6 deputies fanning out, their rifles held at the ready. He was a cold, calculating man who valued order above all else. "This is United States Marshal Clayton Reed," he announced, his voice carrying with absolute authority. "I'm ordering everyone in that cabin to lay down their weapons and come out with their hands in the air." Cordelia looked at Thaddeus, her eyes filled with despair. "He's going to give us back to him," she choked out. "The law says our contracts are binding." Thaddeus's mind raced. Reed was a stickler for the rules. He wouldn't just start shooting. He had to follow procedure. That was his only chance. "Marshal!" Thaddeus shouted through the window. "These women are claiming sanctuary. They're escaping illegal imprisonment and abuse." "That's a lie," Morrison roared. "They're indebted to me. They're my property until they pay." Reed held up a hand for silence, his cold eyes scanning the bullet-riddled cabin. "I want all weapons on the ground. Now, we will sort this out according to territorial law." Territorial law. That was a death sentence. But as Thaddeus looked at the women, he saw something had changed. The terror was gone, replaced by a hard, defiant anger. Belle was checking the action on her rifle. Even young Penny had stopped shaking and was glaring out the window with pure hatred in her eyes. They had tasted a few hours of freedom, and they would rather die than go back to the cage. Just then, one of Morrison's men, feeling cocky now that the law had arrived, made a fatal mistake. He stood up from behind his cover and started walking toward the house, his gun still in his hand. "Party's over, girl," he sneered. "Time to go back to work." He never finished the sentence. A single shot rang out from the cabin window, not from Thaddeus's rifle, but from Belle's. The man yelped and dropped like a sack of rocks, clutching a shattered kneecap. All hell broke loose again. Marshal Reed drew his pistol, spinning around. "We're under fire. Secure the perimeter." His men raised their rifles, no longer neutral observers. Now they were the enemy, too. They were trapped between Morrison's killers and federal lawmen. It was an impossible situation. "Cordelia," Thaddeus said, his voice urgent and low, "the money you took from his safe. Do you still have it?" She nodded, confused. "Every cent. Why?" Thaddeus gave a grim, tight smile. "Because we're about to change the law." He took a deep breath. "Marshal Reed," he bellowed, "I wish to file a formal complaint under federal jurisdiction." Reed paused, his pistol still aimed at the house. His men were advancing, but more slowly now. He was a federal officer. He was legally obligated to hear a federal complaint, even in the middle of a gunfight. "What is the nature of this complaint, Bramwell?" "Human trafficking," Thaddeus yelled back, the words like cannonballs. "Forced servitude and murder. Silas Morrison is holding these women against their will and has killed at least one of them, a girl named Rosie Henderson, for trying to escape." Morrison's face went white with fury. "It's a lie. I have contracts. It's all legal." "A contract to work in a saloon isn't a contract to be a slave," Thaddeus retorted, "and it damn sure ain't a license to kill." Reed was caught. Murder was a federal crime. He couldn't ignore it, no matter how powerful Morrison's friends were. Cordelia moved to the window. "We have proof, Marshal. Proof that he killed Rosie and made it look like she took her own life." "Lies, all lie," Morrison screamed, a hint of panic now in his voice. "We have his ledgers," Belle added, "showing the money he stole from us and the bribes he paid to Sheriff Hackett to look the other way." This was it, the turning point. Reed's eyes narrowed. Corrupting a local lawman was a direct insult to federal authority. He couldn't let that stand. "I need to see this evidence," Reed called out. And that's when Cordelia did something incredibly brave, or incredibly foolish. She unbolted the door and stepped out onto the porch. Her hands were raised high, and in one of them, she clutched a leather satchel. Morrison's men immediately swung their guns toward her, but Reed's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Hold your fire! Nobody shoots unless I give the order." Cordelia walked slowly into the yard, right into the lion's den, and stopped in front of the marshal. "It's all in here," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "His account books. Every crime. Every bribe." Morrison was sweating bullets now. "Don't listen to her, Marshal. She's a thief and a liar. You can't trust her word." But Reed had already taken the satchel and was flipping through the pages. His face, already grim, grew darker with every entry he read. It was all there. Skimmed earnings, coded notes about discipline, and a list of regular payments to Sheriff Hackett. "Marshal," Cordelia said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "look at the entry for July 15th, the day Rosie died." Reed found the page. He stood frozen for a long moment, his eyes locked on the spidery handwriting. Then he slowly looked up, his gaze like chips of ice. "Silas Morrison," he said, his voice flat and cold. In his own hand it reads, "A.R. Henderson, final payment, example made. You are under arrest for murder." Morrison's men looked at each other, their loyalty evaporating in the face of a federal murder charge. One by one, they started dropping their guns. It was over. But Morrison wasn't the kind of man who surrendered. With a roar of pure rage, his hand dropped to his pistol. "No book is going to hang me. No one's going to believe a bunch of whores over me." He was fast, but Thaddeus was faster. A single shot cracked from the cabin porch. At the same instant, Marshal Reed drew and fired his own weapon. 2 bullets struck Morrison in the chest. He staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face before collapsing into the dust. His reign of terror finally at an end. Silence descended on the valley. It was over. The fight was won. But as Thaddeus looked at the women slowly emerging from the cabin, blinking in the twilight, he knew the war was just beginning. They were free, but they were also homeless, penniless, and alone in a world that would judge them for their past. "What happens to us now?" Penny asked, her small voice echoing the fear in all their hearts. Marshal Reed holstered his pistol, his face unreadable. "That's a good question. The territory doesn't have many provisions for ladies in your situation." Cordelia stepped forward, her chin held high. "We have the money from Morrison's safe. It's ours. He stole it from us over the years. It should be enough to start over." "Start over where?" Belle asked, her voice laced with bitterness. "What town is going to roll out the welcome mat for 12 former saloon girls from the Silver Dollar?" The question hung in the air, cold and heavy. They had won their freedom, but what good was freedom if you had nowhere to go? Thaddeus looked out at his ranch, 3,000 acres of empty land that had mirrored his empty heart for a decade. He looked at the 12 women, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and deep, gnawing uncertainty. And he said 2 words that surprised even himself. "Stay here." Cordelia stared at him, her green eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "I said stay here," Thaddeus repeated, the idea taking root and growing stronger as he spoke. "Work the land. Build new lives. This ranch, it's been empty too long. It's big enough. There's good water, good soil. We can make it something more." Marshal Reed raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You're talking about starting a new settlement, Bramwell?" "I'm talking about giving these women a home," Thaddeus said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "A place where their past doesn't matter. They can own land, build houses, raise cattle. They can be their own masters." Belle stepped forward, her gaze skeptical. "Why would you do that for us? You don't know us." Thaddeus looked from Belle to Cordelia to young Penny. "You trusted me with your lives," he said simply. "Seems only fair I trust you with my land." The women looked at each other, a fragile hope dawning in their eyes. For years they had been property. The idea of being property owners was a dream they'd never dared to have. But then Thaddeus realized something. Something that turned his blood to ice. He looked at Marshal Reed. Morrison was a connected man, rich friends, political friends. They're not just going to let this go. They can't afford to have these women testifying. Reed's face was grim. You're right. Morrison was just a franchise owner. The company he worked for is much bigger. They have operations in 6 territories. They're not just slavers. They're kingmakers. And they protect their assets. A new kind of fear settled over the group, colder and deeper than before. They hadn't just killed a saloon owner. They had declared war on a criminal empire. This changes things, Reed said, his voice low. I can take you all into federal protection. Move you to Denver. You'll be safe until we can build a case. Cordelia's face fell. Protective custody? That's just another cage. We'd be living in fear, always looking over our shoulders. We'd never be truly free. There's another way, Thaddeus said, his gaze sweeping over the land his grandfather had carved out of the wilderness. We don't run. We don't hide. We fortify. We make our stand right here. Reed shook his head. Bramwell, you don't understand. These aren't just hired guns. The men who work for this syndicate are ex-military, former bounty hunters. They're an army. They will level this entire ranch to silence these women. Cordelia stepped up beside Thaddeus, the shotgun still in her hands. You'd risk your life again? For us? Thaddeus looked at the faces around him, illuminated by the rising moon. This morning, I was just an old man waiting to die, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You all gave me something to live for. That's worth fighting for. One by one, the other women nodded, their fear being burned away by a hot, fierce resolve. I'm tired of running, Belle declared, her voice like iron. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die on my own land, fighting for my own home. Marshal Reed looked from one determined face to the next, a slow, grudging respect dawning in his eyes. He was a lawman, and his orders would be to take the witnesses into custody, but he was also a man who had seen too much injustice on the frontier. My superiors in the capital won't approve of this, he said almost to himself. Your superiors don't have to live with your conscience, Thaddeus replied quietly. Reed let out a short, sharp laugh. Fair point, Bramwell. He turned to his deputies. Looks like we're staying for a while. Get the bodies loaded up, then we start building barricades. They'll be coming, and they'll be coming with everything they've got. But as his men got to work, one of the deputies found something on Morrison's body. It wasn't a weapon or money. It was a small, coded telegram. Reed read it, and his face went pale. What is it? Thaddeus asked. Reed handed him the paper. The message was simple. Henderson girl failed. Asset compromised. Awaiting instructions. Judge. Thaddeus looked up, confused. What does this mean? It means, Reed said grimly, that one of the women who came here today wasn't running for her life. She was sent here on a mission. There's a traitor among you. The words fell like stones into the silence. The women all looked at each other, a new and terrible poison of suspicion seeping into the fragile trust they had just built. They had survived the attack, but now the real enemy wasn't outside the walls. The real enemy was standing right beside them. One of the 12 women was a spy sent by the syndicate's leader, a mysterious figure they only knew as the Judge. She was sent to find something, and now she was trapped here with the rest of them. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic work and gnawing paranoia. Under Marshal Reed's direction, they turned the ranch into a fortress. They dug trenches, boarded up windows, leaving only small firing slits, and created barricades from wagons and farm equipment. The women worked with a feverish intensity, their fear channeled into hard labor. But every shared glance was tinged with suspicion. Every whispered conversation fell silent when someone else approached. Who was the traitor? Was it Belle, whose tough exterior could be hiding a secret? Was it young Penny, whose vulnerability might be an act? Or was it Cordelia, the natural leader, who had put herself in the spotlight from the very beginning? Thaddeus found himself watching them all, searching for a sign, a slip of the tongue, anything that would give the spy away. But they were all perfect actresses, their faces masks of grim determination. They had all learned to hide their true selves to survive at the Silver Dollar. One of them was just better at it than the others. On the third night, the attack came. It wasn't a full frontal assault. It was smarter than that. Under the cover of a moonless night, a team of 6 men, moving with silent, military precision, slipped past their outer perimeter. They weren't there to kill everyone. They were there for one reason: to burn them out. One of Reed's deputies, on watch in the barn loft, spotted them just in time. The night erupted in a storm of gunfire. The attackers were professionals, using cover and movement with deadly efficiency. They pinned down the defenders in the house while 2 of their men sprinted for the cabin with torches. Thaddeus, firing from an upstairs window, knew they couldn't stop them. The house was going to burn. But then something incredible happened. From the trenches on the far side of the yard, 2 figures rose up. It was Belle and Penny. They had snuck out of the house during the initial chaos, circling around in the darkness. They opened fire on the torchbearers from behind, their shots ringing out in the night. The surprise was total. The 2 men with the torches dropped, and the remaining attackers, their plan ruined and their flank exposed, melted back into the darkness. They had won the first battle. In the aftermath, Thaddeus pulled Belle and Penny aside. "That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice a mix of anger and awe. "You could have been killed." "We had to do something," Belle said, her knuckles white where she gripped her rifle. "We weren't going to wait in that house to be cooked alive." But as Thaddeus looked at them, a cold thought struck him. The move had been brilliant, almost too brilliant, a perfect pincer movement that required incredible courage and tactical awareness. Or was it a setup? A way for the traitor to prove her loyalty to the group? He looked from Belle's hard, unreadable face to Penny's wide, innocent eyes, and the knot of suspicion in his gut tightened. One of them had just saved them all, and one of them was a snake in the grass. The next morning, Marshal Reed rode out to scout their trail. He returned 2 hours later, his face grimmer than ever. "They're not gone, Hinana-san," he said. "They've pulled back and set up a camp in the canyons. They're settling in for a siege, and that's not the worst of it." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a wanted poster. "Their friends in the capital are smearing you. This just came in on the telegraph. It names every one of you," he said, looking at the women. "Wanted for theft, murder, and banditry. There's a $500 bounty on each of your heads." The women gasped. They hadn't just been declared outlaws. They had been given a price. Now every bounty hunter, every desperate farmer, every greedy opportunist in the territory would be coming for them. "The judge isn't just trying to kill you," Thaddeus said, the pieces clicking into place. "He's trying to turn the whole world against you. He's isolating us." Cordelia's face was a mask of cold fury. "So we're trapped. If we stay, his army gets us. If we run, the bounty hunters get us." "There's more," Reed said, his voice heavy. "The poster names you too, Bramwell, for harboring fugitives and killing Morrison. And it names me as a rogue marshal, aiding and abetting criminals." The judge was cutting them off from any possible help. He had turned them into a disease, and the ranch into a quarantine zone. But why? Why go to all this trouble? It was more than just silencing witnesses. There had to be something else at play. Thaddeus looked out at his land, the land his grandfather had bled for. And then he remembered the old stories, the stories his grandfather used to tell him about why he chose this specific valley, a secret the Bramwell family had kept for 2 generations. The secret was buried under the old dead oak tree on the western ridge. Leaving Reed in charge, Thaddeus took a shovel and walked to the ridge. Cordelia followed him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "My grandfather wasn't just a rancher," Thaddeus said as he began to dig. "He was a prospector. He found something on this land, something he knew would bring the wrong kind of attention. So he buried it, and he built his life on top of it to protect it." He dug for 10 minutes before the shovel hit something hard with a metallic thud. He cleared away the dirt to reveal the lid of a heavy iron box. He pried it open. Inside, gleaming in the morning sun, were not gold nuggets or silver bars. It was something much more valuable in this arid land. It was a detailed geological map, hand-drawn by his grandfather, showing the location of a massive underground aquifer, a hidden river flowing right beneath the ranch. In a territory where water was more precious than gold, his land was an untapped diamond mine. "That's what they're after," Cordelia breathed, her eyes wide. The judge doesn't just want to silence us. He wants your land. He wants the water. The railroad was coming through the territory. Whoever controlled the water controlled where the railroad would go, where the new towns would be built. Control of this aquifer meant control of the future of the entire territory. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about power and money on a scale he could barely imagine. And now he understood Rosie's real story. Rosie wasn't just a saloon girl, Thaddeus said, thinking aloud. Her father was a surveyor. He must have known about this aquifer. He probably told her about it before he died. That's what she knew. Not just about Morrison's crimes, but about the judge's ultimate prize. That's why she had to be silenced. But as he looked at the map, he saw a small notation in his grandfather's handwriting next to a drawing of a narrow canyon at the back of his property. It said, "The back door." It was an old mining tunnel, long collapsed and forgotten. A way out. Hope surged through him. They could escape. They could use the tunnel to slip past the siege and make a run for it. But as they rushed back to the cabin to share the news, they were met with a scene of horror. One of Marshal Reed's deputies lay dead on the ground, a knife in his back. And Marshal Reed himself was on his knees, his hands tied, a gun to his head. Holding the gun was the last person anyone would have suspected. It was Penny, the young, terrified girl. Her face was no longer innocent. It was cold, hard, and filled with a chilling emptiness. "The game's over," she said, her voice devoid of the childish tremble it once held. "Drop your weapons, now." "Penny, why?" Cordelia whispered, her face a canvas of betrayal and shock. Penny laughed, a sound that didn't belong to a 17-year-old girl. It was the sound of broken glass and old secrets. "My real name isn't Penny," she said, her eyes boring into Thaddeus. "It's Penelope Morrison. Silas was my father." The confession stunned everyone into silence. "He was a monster," Penelope spat. "But he was my father. And you," she said, her gaze shifting to Thaddeus. "You killed him. But this isn't just about him. He was small time. The judge. He's the one who gave me a purpose." She was the spy. She had been playing them all from the very beginning. Her terror, her tears, it was all an act. A brilliant, flawless performance. She had used her youth and apparent fragility as the perfect cover. "The judge wants the map, Bramwell," Penelope said. "He knows about the water. Rosie told my father about it before he killed her. The judge knows everything. He sent me in with the others to find where your grandfather hid his research. He figured once you were under pressure, you'd go right to it, and you did." She gestured with her pistol. "Now give it to me, and I might let the others live." "You'll kill us all anyway," Thaddeus said, his mind racing, trying to find a way out of this new nightmare. "Probably," she admitted with a shrug, "but give me the map, and you'll die quicker." It was a checkmate. They were caught. But then Belle, who had been standing silently near the side of the cabin, made her move. She didn't have a gun. She had something better. In her hand was a small, crudely made doll. "Before you do anything, Penelope," Belle said, her voice surprisingly calm, "you should know what this is." Penelope glanced at the doll, a flicker of confusion on her face. "What is that piece of trash?" "It belonged to Rosie," Belle said quietly. "She gave it to me the night before she tried to run. She told me if anything ever happened to her, to make sure this got to the right people. She said it was her insurance." Belle held the doll up. "It's not just a doll. Rosie was clever. She sewed something into the stuffing." She began to carefully pull at a seam in the doll's back. "She told me her father, the surveyor, made another map, a copy. He gave it to the territorial governor, the old governor, before he was replaced by the judge's man. Rosie said the original survey and water rights claim were filed legally, years ago, under a different name. All the proof needed to show the Bramwell claim is the original and legal one. And the name of the holding company, the proof of the filing, it's all written on a piece of oilcloth, right here, inside this doll." Penelope's cold composure finally cracked. Her face went white. If that document existed, the judge's entire plan to seize the water rights would be impossible. He could kill them all, but he could never legally claim the land. "You're lying," she hissed, but her voice wavered. "Am I?" Belle asked, her fingers still working at the seam. "There's only one way to find out. But if you shoot the marshal, I'll burn this doll, and the judge will never get his prize. You'll have failed. And you know what the judge does to people who fail him. It was a brilliant bluff. Thaddeus didn't know if the paper was real or not, but Penelope believed it. She was trapped. She couldn't kill them because she needed the doll, and she couldn't let them live because they were witnesses. In that moment of hesitation, Thaddeus acted. He threw the heavy geological map at Penelope, forcing her to duck. At the same instant, Cordelia charged, tackling her to the ground. The gun went off, the bullet harmlessly burying itself in the dirt. Marshal Reed, his hands now free, lunged for the pistol. It was over in seconds. Penelope Morrison was their prisoner. They tied her up in the root cellar. The siege outside was still waiting, but the dynamics inside the fortress had changed. The traitor was caught. The secret of the water was out. And Belle's bluff had bought them time, but it was only a bluff. She showed Thaddeus the doll later. There was nothing inside but old cotton stuffing. Rosie gave me the doll, she explained, but she just said it would bring me luck. I made up the rest. Thaddeus looked at her with newfound respect. You saved us all with a story. It's what we do, Belle said with a sad smile. We tell men the stories they want to hear. I just told one that mattered. But their victory was short-lived. That evening, a lone rider approached the ranch under a white flag. It wasn't one of the hired guns. It was a man in a fine suit, a lawyer from the capital. He brought a message from the judge. He offers you terms, the lawyer said, his face impassive. Hand over Penelope Morrison and the map of the aquifer. In exchange, he will grant the rest of you safe passage out of the territory. You will be given enough money to start new lives. You have 1 hour to decide. It was the devil's bargain. They could save their own skins by sacrificing Penelope and the future of the territory, or they could stand their ground and face certain death when the main force attacked. The women were torn. Some wanted to take the deal. They had fought enough. They just wanted to be free. Others, led by Cordelia, refused. If we give him that water, Cordelia argued, we're condemning thousands of people to his rule. We'd be no better than him. The argument raged, tearing the fragile community apart. Thaddeus let them debate. The choice had to be theirs. Finally, they turned to him. What do you think, Thad? Belle asked. Thaddeus looked at their tired, frightened faces, and he knew what he had to do. There's a third option, he said. We give the judge exactly what he wants, but we do it on our terms. He explained his plan. It was audacious, reckless, and likely to get them all killed, but it was the only chance they had. An hour later, the lawyer rode back to the judge's camp. He carried their answer. They had accepted the deal. That night, under a full moon, Thaddeus and Cordelia rode out to meet the judge, carrying the map and a bound and gagged Penelope. They met him in a clearing a mile from the ranch. The judge was not what Thaddeus expected. He was a distinguished, silver-haired man who looked more like a senator than a crime lord. He was surrounded by 20 heavily armed men. Mr. Bramwell, the judge said with a thin, reptilian smile, a pleasure. I see you've come to your senses. Here's the map, Thaddeus said, handing it over, and the girl. Now give us the money and the clear passage you promised. The judge chuckled as he examined the map. My dear man, you can't possibly believe I would let any of you live. You know too much. He gestured to his men. Kill them. But just as his men raised their rifles, a new voice cut through the night. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Marshal Reed and his deputies stepped out from behind the rocks, their own rifles leveled. And with them were the other 10 women, each one armed and positioned in the rocks above the clearing, creating a perfect circle of fire. The judge's men were caught in a trap. What is this? The judge hissed, his composure finally breaking. You were supposed to be watching the ranch. Oh, we were, Reed said with a grin. We just moved the ranch. While you were watching the cabin, we were slipping out the back door. The old mining tunnel your spy didn't know about. The judge stared in disbelief. The figure of Penelope, still bound and gagged, suddenly straightened up and pulled off her gag and wig. It wasn't Penelope, it was Belle in disguise. Looking for this? Belle asked, holding up the real map, the one Thaddeus had kept hidden. The map the judge held was a fake. And as for the real Penelope, Thaddeus said, She's on her way to the federal courthouse in Denver with a signed confession detailing your entire operation. She traded you for a lighter sentence. Seems loyalty isn't a Morrison family trait. The judge was speechless. He had been outmaneuvered at every turn. His men looked around nervously, trapped in the crossfire. "It's over, Judge," Reed said. "Surrender now." For a long moment, the judge just stood there, his empire crumbling around him. Then with a scream of rage, he drew a hidden pistol and fired at Thaddeus. But Cordelia was faster. Her shotgun boomed in the night, and the judge fell, his reign of tyranny ending in the same dust as his underling, Silas Morrison. His men, leaderless and surrounded, threw down their weapons. The sun rose the next morning on a new world. The syndicate was broken. The women were truly free. And Thaddeus Bramwell's ranch, once a monument to loneliness and loss, was now the foundation of a new community, a town they decided to call Second Chance. They used the money from the bounties, which were now rescinded and paid to them as a reward, to buy the surrounding land. They built homes, a school, and a trading post. Women from all over the territory, women escaping lives like the one they had fled, heard the stories and came to Second Chance, seeking refuge and a new beginning. Thaddeus Bramwell, the man who wanted to be alone, found himself the patriarch of a thriving town, his heart no longer walled off but open to the life and laughter that now filled his valley. He had faced down his past and, in doing so, had built a future he never could have imagined. He had discovered that a home isn't just land or a house. It's the people you're willing to fight for. The story of the lone rancher and the 12 Saloon girls became a legend in the territory, a tale of courage, redemption, and the extraordinary things ordinary people can do when they stand together. They proved that a second chance isn't something you're given. It's something you build with your own two hands and defend with all your heart. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure. And let me ask you a question for the comments. When it all came down to it, who do you think was the bravest person in this story? I can't wait to read your answers. Until next time, stay safe out there.